I'm very privileged, and I think all of us are, seeing this as a talk mainly to the entomological community. The fact that we live amongst insects, that we work with insects, that we study with insects, because Africa, and Southern Africa in particular, has an absolutely unbelievable fauna. And this is really what we have tried to do in these 3 books that I'll be racing through today. The first one is already published. It's this one here that was published by Strake a year or 2 ago. The next one I'll get to in a little while, and then the third one after that. The second one is at proof stage at the moment, so hopefully, with a little bit of luck, it'll be out by the end of the year. I'll say a little bit more about that when I get to talking about it. And then the third one, we're still busy writing. I'd just like to acknowledge my collaborators. For the first book, my wife Jenny Scholtz, and then Henny de Clarke, who's also my collaborator on the other 2 books, so all 3 books. People are under the impression that, because it's an entomological book, the entomologist is the person who was mainly responsible. That's, of course, absolutely not true, because my co-authors, my collaborators, have had as much intellectual input into these books as I have. And then, of course, the photographs, the spectacular photographs used in all 3 books were mainly produced by Henny, and there are about 5,000 or so in these 3 books. So I'll only be showing about 4,000 of them in this series of talks. Not really. Right, and then I'd also need to acknowledge the international members of the entomological community, and of course our own members of the entomological community. This work is a review, these works are reviews, of course, of 200 years of entomological research in Southern Africa, and hundreds of people have contributed to it, and we have referenced hundreds of papers. So hopefully we've given a fairly comprehensive review. There are about 200 people who've been actively involved in contributing in some way to this book, either as support staff or as people who've identified insects for us all across the world, and then locally, and then many farmers and nature conservation people who've allowed us onto their premises. All of these people are acknowledged in the relevant book. Just one rather sad note that I just want here is that so many South Africans contributed, and yet 2 refused point blank to have anything to do with these projects. I was very tempted to mention their names, but I won't. They're both professional entomologists, and they know who they are. And then, of course, many ex-students and current and past colleagues have contributed to this work. And I'd like to just ask you to spend a moment thinking about a colleague of mine, Sue Nicholson, a colleague of ours, Sue Nicholson, who's desperately ill at the moment, and she needs everybody's support. She was on the staff at the University of Pretoria for 25 years, and she was at UCT before that, so she will be very well known to most people in the entomological fraternity. And then just a last word of thanks to the publishers of these 3 books, Strake for 1 and 2, or at least book 1 and book 3. Book 3 is on dung beetles. I'll get to it later. And I would just like to thank Pippa Parker and her team. And I'm just amazed that they were prepared to take on another book from me, because I threw regular tantrums while we were going through the first book. But anyway, they've obviously got thick skins, and they are happy to take on, or they're prepared to take on, a 3rd book with us. And then the 2nd book is being published by Protea Bookhouse. It's being edited by Joan Marie Barentzer. It's interesting because when we first met, she said she had a soft spot for insects. It turns out that she actually has a soft spot for an entomologist. Her husband happens to be an entomologist at Stellenbosch University, James Pryke. So we have a very good team of entomologists and entomological enthusiasts working on book 2. And then finally, I'd just like to mention that the Oppenheimer family sponsored book 2. So without further ado, I'd like to then get on with my talk. I'm afraid I have to kind of race through it because there's a lot to get through. But the book 1 is available already. People who don't have a copy should be ashamed of themselves, but it's not too late to get copies, and the details are available from on Strike website and every decent bookshop in the country. So then I just like to go, and I'll just start with a short overview of the first book, and then go into second book and third book. Right, thank you, everybody. I'm just going to move my laptop a little closer and find my wine glass. And then you are screen sharing. Charlene, is that all right? I mean, is that?
Perfect, perfect. Thanks, Clarke. We can see the full screen.
But I've got all these signs saying a participant has enabled closed captioning.
Oh, that's just for the, I think that's for the recording. You can just close
so
that.
I'll just ignore it or close it.
You can close, you can just ignore it. Yeah.
Okay. Right. Thank you, everybody. So then this is the cover of Pollinators, Predators. Those of you who have the book, it was designed around the 9 biomes of South Africa. And then we treated the major insect groups as ecological entities, pollinators, predators, parasites, and decomposers in each of those biomes. And in each of the chapters, then we have 1 or 2 or more insects that we identify as for case studies for that particular biome. Of course, the bigger biomes get more attention than the smaller biomes. Then we also included, besides formal biomes, we also included a freshwater habitat because we have such a rich fauna in Southern Africa. A cave habitat, likewise, a very rich cave fauna. Coastal zone, not so rich, but very interesting all the same. And then the urban environment, which affects all of us. Right, and then the case study I chose to start with is this one from the Namaqualand. This will be familiar to many of you. Those white circles are of heelwolkies, mounds. They don't have a good English equivalent name. It means little hill or little mound. These are actually raised areas. I'm sure many of you are aware of them. And they're raised and have different vegetation because the soil chemistry and plant composition is completely different. And these are ancient termite mounds. And the termites, they're still with us. This is a termite. It's called Microhodotermes, a harvester termite. They harvest these little sticks mainly, and then they make a huge they have a huge ecological importance. They're ecosystem engineers. They bring soil up, they dig holes under the ground. So all the soil that's come up here, of course, there's an equivalent area of space under there. So water penetrates, air penetrates, and the composition of the plants on them changes dramatically. Then this has a very characteristic group also in the Namaqualand. These are called spoonwing lacewings. It's a fascinating group. About, I think 70% or so of the world's fauna occurs in Southern Africa and mainly in Namaqualand. And many of them are very specialist pollinators of the special plants that the Karoo is so, the Namaqualand is so famous for. And then the Karoo, and another one of the insects that is an ecosystem engineer or a keystone species in this case. This is Mesor, the carpet or the seed-bearing ant, harvester ant. They contribute also to digging over the soil, harvesting seed, regenerating seed, and then also their tunnels and all the rest of it allow water penetration, and they increase the organic content, which makes for much richer soil for the many plants. Then another of the well-known Karoo species, this is the brown locust, well known for its swarming. One of the parasites we chose was this lovely little teddy bear-like thing in the top right-hand corner. It's about the size of the tip of your thumb. and it lives in the nasal cavities of these groups of antelope that are closely related to wildebeest. They then suck blood in the nasal cavities, so this poor fellow is probably trying to extricate one there. But anyway, this is what the fly looks like. Beautiful animals, but probably not so nice to have a handful of these in your nostrils. And then pollinators, one of the famous groups of pollinators, of course, in Africa is fig pollinators, a very special system, which unfortunately we don't have time to go into, but this is what the female looks like, and this is what the male looks like. The female then pollinates the figs, but each fig is a whole ecosystem. It looks like this cut through a fig. So the next time you eat a fig, those crunchy bits, this is what you're crunching. No, not really. These are only in developing figs, not in ripe figs. But anyway, I always tease our students and tell them that the crunchy bits in figs are the insects. And then the predators, we have some of the biggest, of course, predators in the world, insect predators. This is a thing called a monster tiger beetle, Manticora. There are 20 odd species or so in Southern Africa. On the east coast, the northeast coast, this is a weaver ant. Really fascinating ants. They live in these woven nests, and the process is absolutely incredible because there's a lot of physics involved. Because what the ants do is a few of them start by curling over a leaf, and then others attach to them, and they form a chain of members, and then they ratchet together in sequence, and they roll the leaf over, and then when they've got the leaf rolled over, another worker comes along with one of the larvae, one of their babies, and gives it a gentle squeeze, and it then produces silk. And the silk is then used, it's used as a shuttle in a loom, and it then sticks the leaves together, and then that is what the nest consists of. Another one of the famous northeast eastern parts of the country, a tsetse fly. Henny and I used to take it in turns to offer our bodies for some blood-feeding insect to feed on. This is Henny's hairy arm being fed on by a nice Glossina austini, one of the tsetse flies, the transmitters of sleeping sickness in humans, and Nagana in cattle, although sleeping sickness doesn't occur in South Africa. Nagana is a very serious disease in Zululand. In the aquatic ecosystem, full of life, dragonflies and damselflies. These are some nymphs of dragon and damselflies, are amongst the most spectacular. And then the cave fauna, made famous by Mervyn Mansell, who will be known to many of you. These very unusual threadwing lacewings, tiny little things that live inside the dark recesses of the caves. Some of them have long necks. The first of these was described from the Great Pyramid at Giza in Egypt, and they didn't know what it was. There's a whole history to it. Get the book and you'll read the history. And then the urban environment, I just threw in this German cockroach. Apparently there's a cockroach outbreak across many parts of South Africa. I know in parts of Pretoria there certainly is. So this particular cockroach is causing lots of excitement at the moment, and it's one of the regular inhabitants of urban environments and our homes. Then book number 2, this is going to be a monster. We're at proof stage already. It's going to be 850 pages long and have more than 3,000 of Henny's photographs in it. When I think of the size of this, it reminds me of an external examiner we had for a very thick student thesis many years ago, a famous dipterist at Natal Museum, Brian Stuckenberg, and he said the only objection he had to this big thick thesis was that it creased his trousers when he read it on his lap. So this is going to be along those lines. Hopefully it'll be affordable, but it's going to be a textbook, hopefully covering just about all aspects of insect biology in Southern Africa. So those are the chapters. I'm just going to briefly, unfortunately, of course, very briefly, just refer to some of the major ones. So insects and their significance, insects and humans, their origin, systematics, adaptations, morphology, sensory systems, metamorphosis and growth, reproduction, defense, social insects, fundamentals of feeding, interactions between insects and plants, feeding on plants, feeding on algae, etc., feeding on vertebrates, that's us, feeding on insects and other invertebrates, feeding on dung, carrion, remains, inquilines, things that live in a close association with them, migration, and then the diversity of the very rich fauna in South Africa. So insects of importance to us, of course, are pollinators. Pests are important to us. Here's the brown locust again. One of our chapters is on the origin of insects. This is a scarab fossil, 46-million-year-old Eocene fossil described very recently by Werner Strumpfer of Ditsong Museum in Pretoria, and it's named after Ian Mackay, who was until quite recently just a middle-aged insect paleontologist at Wits University who died very suddenly. So the fossil is named after him. Then we have a chapter on relationships, phylogenies, and the evolution of different groups. A lot of this is based on the molecular studies of Professor Catherine Soul at the University of Pretoria. There's a chapter on morphology, and we talk a lot about mouth parts and head capsules and that sort of thing, because most insects, of course, or all insects feed at some stage. And so mouth parts are a very important part of the anatomy, and all other kinds of mouth parts are derived from this kind of mandibular type. This is an antlion larva. This particular one, they live in pits in very inhospitable hot soil, and their physiology, of course, is also something quite spectacular. Then this is a small fly that may or may not be familiar to people who travel a lot in Namaqualand. The flower itself is called a beetle daisy, and it was called that because an early botanist was surprised that he very seldom found beetles sitting on it, and he proposed that these black spots implied that showed beetles, that it appeared as though there were already beetles on the flower, so best to avoid that one. But in fact, we now know that these plants are pollinated by these tiny little flies. These are 5-millimeter long flies, and that they feed on the plants, but that the males also pounce on these, assuming them to be females. And then when they pounce, of course, they also pollinate the plant, but they also use them as hot blankets, as thermal blankets. They sit on these black patches when they warm up in the sun. So there's the whole physiology is completely integrated and very complex. Then we have a chapter on sensory systems. Of course, sound is a very important one, as in this sound producing cicada. Everybody, I'm sure, is familiar with cicadas and the loud sounds that they produce. We go into the details of hearing and sound production in various insect groups, and many groups of insects produce sound and are capable of hearing. Then we also go through the, different types of metamorphosis that you get in insects. You get these very primitive insects that are ametamorphic. In other words, they don't have typical changeover during metamorphosis. We talk, of course, about the hemimetabolic groups. These are ones where the immatures look just like an adult. They just grow in size, and their reproductive organs and their wings and that sort of thing just develop more and more. So the young ones just look basically like the older ones. And then the holometabolic insects, most of our insects are the ones that have an egg, a larva, and a pupa, as in this butterfly, and an adult. Then there's a long chapter on defense. Of course, insects need to be able to defend themselves against predators and parasites. And one of the ways they do this is some of them have bright colors. These are warning colors. And these, in this particular case, these locusts are nasty tasting, and they advertise the fact that they have these warning or aposematic colors. Then we've got a very long chapter on social systems, starting with very simple aggregations. This is one of those stink locusts, as in the previous locust. That one they call stink locusts or foam locusts or something along those lines. These are young ones before they've got a different set of bright colors, but they also aggregate, and the aggregation, during aggregation, they warm up, but then they also, of course, they increase the advertised unpalatability so that they're not bothered. So this is a very simple form of social interaction. Then we get primitive bees that have a much more developed sense of involvement with their offspring. They have a nest that they provision, and they provide food for their offspring, and they have often a semi-permanent nest, so they have strong fidelity to a particular area and then to their brood. And then groups such as these wasps are very advanced along the social scale. They're eusocial, there's overlap of generations and interaction.
Thank you very much. Never mind, lovey.
You can watch some more. You just can't hear.
When it's down.
Can I please
When your
remind
phone's
all
down
authors to
I
mute?
won't-
Touch the gun.
Oh, never mind, Lillian. Take it away from me. Take it away from me. I touched the wrong thing all the bloody time.
Sorry for that.
I've tried
Shunay,
to
can you
drop
please
in
mute
the phone and I've tried
or
to-
remove
trying to
that?
find them.
Sheila Mansell.
You must just hold it like this, Mommy.
Okay, well, we can hear just,
Okay, apologies.
I'll just carry on. And then, of course, the pinnacle of social behavior is the termites, which have these very elaborate mounds with with cooling systems, heating systems, and all the rest of it that goes.
I'm not watching it anymore in case the pylon collapses or something and you can't charge your phone.
I don't know why I can't mute her. Yeah, there's not a microphone option.
Okay.
Mute.
All right. Anyway, so there we go. I'll just talk over it.
I never touched a thing.
Then there's a chapter on plant insect interactions, and the main focus is on galls and these different and we have hundreds of different kinds of galls produced by many different organisms, including flies, different flies. This is a fruit fly, and then this is one that may be familiar to everybody. It occurs on these very small wasps occur on coral tree leaves, and they are widespread on corals and have become a pest in certain parts of the world. They've spread from Africa to coral trees, which are domestic plants in many parts of the world.
Use the words at the bottom here, but something about his voice, so they can't hear him properly either.
Excuse me,
Now, Clarke's
Lillian.
looking very
Excuse
puzzled
me,
now.
anyone? Can you please mute yourself? Thank you. Sorry, Clarke.
Okay. Sorry, I'll just go back. Yeah. So these are galls, and many different insects cause them, and they have all kinds of different shapes and sizes and this sort of thing. And then this one that is familiar to many people on coral trees throughout South Africa. And there's a whole ecosystem inside these, because they're the ones that cause the galls, and then they're parasites that parasitize them, and hyperparasitoids that are parasites on them. And then fungus feeding. This is these are blowflies on a carrion flower. They're attracted to this sticky stuff. This is sort of deceptive pollen, well, not pollination really, it's deceptive spore dispersal, because these flowers smell like carrion, attracts blowflies, and they often lay eggs on them, which of course die. But after that, they've then carried spores on, hopefully, to the next one. Then this is a tiny true fungus feeder, a little thing belonging to the family Ceeidae, 2 to 3 millimeters long. Adults and larvae live in polypore fungi. This is one of the, and their popular name is not surprisingly is minute fungus beetles, which is, of course, is what they are. And then vertebrate predators. There we are to Henny and his arm, and a tsetse fly again. This is the same species, the only one that still occurs in Southern Africa. And no, it's not actually, sorry, there's another one. This is the more common one in South Africa. So Paris, feeding on vertebrates, and then feeding on invertebrates, as in this aphid parasitoid, one of the very characteristic parasitoids, tiny little things, a magnificent photograph. And then insect predators, such as this robber fly, bacillids. The ant itself is an apex predator, and here it's being preyed on by a specialist bacillid, a specialist fly, parasitic predatory fly. And then remains, of course, of animals. This beetle is a trogid, so-called keratin beetle. Those of you who were ever students in our department will remember that I had a fixation with them. I worked on them for many years. Very interesting. It's one of the few groups of organisms that's capable of digesting keratin. No vertebrates can, and only a handful of insect families are capable of. And this is another one of the very interesting insects. I'm sure many of you have seen these old horns on game farms and farms with these tubes protruding from them. Those tubes are the larval homes of this moth, and it's another one of the very few insects that is capable of digesting, in this case, these horns. You wouldn't think anything would be capable of feeding on horns, but horns are a little different to our fingernails, our hair, toenails, and that sort of thing. It's all just composed of a very tough protein called keratin, and these insects. So they'll feed on every aspect of an animal or plant from one end to the other. Then the chapter on inquilines. These are insects that live with others. This is a very interesting group of monotypic so-called dung beetles, although they don't feed on dung beetles, but they're in the group belonging to dung beetles. And they live in very close association with the very aggressive matabili ants. Here they are moving nest, the two little beetles moving along with the matabili ants. So their larvae, the beetle larvae, breed inside the nests of the matabili ants. They feed on decomposing dead ants, plant litter, and that sort of thing. So they really feed inside the compost heaps inside the ant nests. And then the final biology chapter is on migrations, and this is a species that will be familiar to just about everybody in Southern Africa, the famous white butterfly, the brown-veined white butterfly that migrates across the country, usually from a southwesterly to a northeasterly direction. Some years they're active in tens of thousands, millions of them traveling across the country. I think last year around about Christmas, there was a big outbreak of them. And then just the diversity. I just mentioned the diversity, of course, is broken up into taxonomic groups. So the two families of ametamorphic insects, many families, I forget how many, 13, 14 families, something like that, of hemimetabolic insects, and then the remaining 10 or so families are of holometabolic insects. These are the ones with a pupal stage, a larval and a pupal stage. And although there are fewer orders, there are many more groups within, at least although there are fewer families in the holometabolic groups, there are many more insects in each of those groups. So in total, they amount to more numbers of insects in the holometabolic groups than in the others. Right, and then I see I'm getting along on my time. I'd just like to run through book 3 then. This is the one that's in development. And gone the same route. There'll be several chapters: dung beetles in context, the community, their habitat choice. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the fact that dung beetles, and especially dung beetles in Africa, are very famous because of their association with big amounts of dung, like elephant dung and all that kind of stuff. We actually get, I'm aware of a group of Japanese tourists who want to come to South Africa soon just to see dung beetles. So, I mean, they are world renowned. And so hopefully our book then will do justice to them. So then just briefly then, their distant relatives, some of these groups that may be familiar: stag beetles. There's a famous one on the Cape High Mountains. There's another keratin beetle. These are fairly obscure, door beetles, and these flesh beetles also fairly obscure. The entomologists amongst you will probably recognize the names. Then these are the groups that are less distantly related. They're all within the family Scarabaeidae, cousins of dung beetles. So they're different kinds of chasers, rhinoceros beetles, and that the sort of flying peanuts that come to your light at night in spring. These are all members of related groups. Then dung beetles are part of a much bigger community, of course, that they share with many other insects, mostly flies, other flies, but the flies then lay eggs, and the eggs and the maggots attract predatory groups of insects and that sort of thing. So you have a whole ecosystem. But the dung beetles are usually dominant, and they are inclined to influence the dung and the colonization. So if you get a lot of activity by dung beetles, you get less activity from flies, something that I'm going to mention briefly, one of the reasons for the introduction of dung beetles into Australia. Right, we divide the dung beetles up into 4 major groups. Those that roll balls, those are the ones that are most familiar to people, but only about maybe 10% or so of our dung beetles are ball rollers. Most of them belong to this group, the so-called tunnelers. These ones dig deep tunnels, this particular group, up to 1 meter deep or so, and bury 5 or 6 or 10 brood balls the size of tennis balls. So, I mean, these are really productive, massively important in dung beetle biology and in the turnover of pasture. So they're very important in ecosystem function, of course. These ones are called dwellers. They nest inside the dung, so they're mostly active when the rollers and the tunnelers are not active, a specialized group. And then there's the final group is these tiny, there's a red arrow pointing to one of them there. That's just to give you some scale. These are tiny, and they are parasitic on the brood of or the parasitic on the nest contents pulled together by big dung beetles. So they colonize the dung when it's being rolled or when it's being buried. They lay their eggs in the dung, so they don't have to provision their nests themselves. Their nests are provisioned by the bigger dung beetles, and they just breed in it. And there are records of 20 or 30 different species of these in 1 or 2 nests of dung beetles. So you get big numbers of them. Then dung beetles also facilitate the dung ecosystem by moving other animals around, other organisms around. Here there's some mites, predatory mites. Mites can't fly, so the dung beetles transport them from one source of dung to the other. So they're passengers. This is called phoresis. They hitch a ride on the beetles. And then also these flies, although these flies are capable of flight, their flight is fairly weak. And they also ride on dung beetles. These are called lesser dung flies. So they breed in dung, but they're transported mainly from one dung source to another by dung beetles. And then the type of dung consumed by dung beetles covers every possibility: herbivores, omnivores. This is a very specialized mushroom feeder. They very unusual. It's a group. This particular group occurs only in Southern Africa, mainly in South Africa, but they feed mainly on toadstools and that sort of thing. And then another group of Southern African species feed only on dead millipedes. And there's a whole interesting biology associated with them feeding on dead millipedes, and then ones that feed on.
And put it on again just before the end when he says goodbye.
On carrion.
I'm so worried.
Or human.
These ones feed on carrion, so as in this case, yeah. And then we have deviations from feeding on dry dung and feeding on detritus and all this sort of thing. So these are not still, this is strictly a dung beetle, feeds on dry dung. This one is closely related to that, but doesn't feed on dung at all, but on pieces of leaves and that sort of thing, on detritus. This is an unusual one. These ones feed on dung pellets, and you can't see it too clearly here, but they have a forked, a fork on the tip of the nose there that they use for manipulating dung pellets, such as those produced by sheep and goats. And then, of course, most of our antelope produce pelleted dung. And then another interesting biological attribute is that these big rollers have lost their hands, basically their fingers and toes, their tarsi, because when they roll a ball, they push down on the ground. And so flimsy tarsi like that would probably just be more of a hassle than anything else. So they've lost them in evolutionary time. This group have these particularly long legs, with which they use middle and hind legs, which they use to manipulate the dung balls. This particular group are called Sisyphus. Those of you who remember your Greek mythology will remember Sisyphus was the Greek god who was banished to the underground to go and roll a rock up an incline in perpetuity. So the early entomologists who saw these small dung beetles rolling these big balls named it Sisyphus after the Greek god. Then the tunnelers have short stubby legs that they use to enable them to dig. So they obviously don't need to be able to roll, so they need to be able to dig, and so their legs are adapted. Their morphology changes also according to their biology. Here we have the same species, two males. I don't know why it doesn't like me moving my two males. The one on the left is called a major male. The one on the right, a minor male, and they have completely different reproductive behavior. The one on the left, the major male, they are called guards during reproduction. So they guard females that are busy nesting, and with those horns, they then fight off any other male. These are called sneaks, and they don't fight. They then burrow down into the soil and avoid conflict. So you have a case here of somebody with brawn and somebody with brains both accessing the females, and their reproductive success is more or less the same, but they look completely different. And the same in this particular case. This is another interesting group that one can just tell. When beetles fly, these are called elytra, their hind wings. They lift their elytra, usually at right angles to the body. And then they fold out their hind wings, their flying wings. The elytra are not directly involved in flight at all. They flip out the main membranous wings that they fly with. But these ones don't open their elytra, they just lift them, and then they flip the membranous wings, the flying wings, through this cavity here on the side. And this is called a pleural cavity, and it's characteristic of this group that's called gymnopleurines, the pleurines, the ones with a cavity in their pleuris. Then competition, of course, is fierce. We have records of, in the Kruger Park, of 7,000 individuals in a pile of elephant dung. There's an even more impressive record from East Africa, where they collected 16,000 individual dung beetles just in a pile of elephant dung. So competition is particularly fierce. And here we have competition, possibly a male competing with another male for the female, but also competing for the resource itself. And then also closely related individuals, in order to be able to utilize the resource to the best of their ability. Not everybody can be active at the same time, otherwise there'll just be a train smash of people of beetles at the dung. So they've divided the day up into activity periods. So this Caronitus is active during the day. His cousin, this one, is active just at sunset. and then their distant cousin. This big one is active also at sunset, but also in the early mornings. And we just put in this slide here just to show that in the previous example where I showed the males with big horns, that's usually what happens in dung beetles. If it has a big horn, it's a male. In this case, the female has the bigger horn than the male. We're not sure of the reason for that, but of course there's lots of potential speculation. And then the larvae of all of them live inside some sort of a cavity, either a brood ball or a tube of dung or something like that. And their body shape is adjusted so that they can function inside. So they triangulate inside there. So movement is by pressing with the head and this part of the abdomen and that part of the tail against the inside, and so they can control their movement inside the ball. This is a fermentation chamber, like a ruminant has for digesting coarse food. And then they also have what's called a plastering trowel. When their ball starts to dry out and starts to crack, they excrete some dung, and then they plaster the inside of the dung ball. So their whole biology is adapted for life inside a closed cavity. And then the ecological importance of dung beetles, I mean, we can't possibly overemphasize it. Whoops. There are 14 million cattle in South Africa, and they produce 400,000 tons of dung per day. And then there are 30 million sheep and goats that produce a whole lot more. And elephants produce 150 kilograms of dung each. There are about 10,000 elephants in the Kruger Park. And then there are game animals all over the country on game farms and various other places. So a huge amount of dung. And then there are politicians, of course, who contribute as well. And what happens to it? It's gone. And it's gone because dung beetles are there, and they're active, and they're burying it, and they're fertilizing the soil, they're aerating the soil, they're allowing water to penetrate. So they're absolutely essential to every ecosystem. And because of it, dung beetles were introduced into Australia. South African dung beetles, a large number. These are 3 of the species that have been very successful in Australia. If you don't remember the story about why there are no dung beetles in Australia, you'll have to read our book number 1 has it in, and book number 2 will have it, and book number 3 will also have it, because it's such a riveting story and such an important story of the biological control of dung in Australia by dung beetles. We also study their classification, but this has changed dramatically over the years. In the 1960s, there were just 2 simple major groups. Now we have, as a result of molecular biology and molecular studies, we now have different groups, and they've arranged completely differently. So we now have a different evolutionary interpretation of their relationships than people did in 1960. And then they're also fantastic models for various biological behaviors. There's been some absolutely spectacular work done by Marcus Byrne at Wits University and his Swedish colleagues on orientation in dung beetles. This is one checking out the scene, but they have a dorsal eye that they can pick up celestial cues, and they are capable of reading light and fixing a particular direction from sunlight, moonlight, starlight, the Milky Way. Some absolutely fantastic work, and that'll be reviewed as well in this book. Then there's the ancient scarab of ancient Egypt, the sacred scarab, which I'm sure many of you will know about. Scarabs have been revered in Africa for the last 6,000 years or so. There's a whole history of the relationship between dung beetles. Unfortunately, we can't go into it, but this is all covered in great detail in our various books. And then, unfortunately, dung beetles are also preyed on by a group of specialized groups of insects. This is a particular robber fly that feeds only on dung beetles. So they sit around, and when the dung beetles fly in, they zap them. And then, of course, like us and everything else, they get fungal diseases, pathogenic diseases, such as this Bavaria fungus on this dung beetle here. And then, of course, we're very concerned about their conservation. So there's a chapter on conservation. And just for interest's sake, this is a species that we only know from elephant dung, and this is what it's been, where it's known. Elephant dung in the Kruger Park, on the Botswana border in Zimbabwe, and then in northern Namibia. So the conservation of elephants is not only about the conservation of elephants, it's also about the conservation of their dung fauna. And then finally, of course, we will go into the details of dung beetle diversity in great detail. But here I would just like to mention and pay tribute to my colleague and friend Adrian Davis, who produced this 850-page tome a year or so ago on Southern African dung beetles. Adrian will be remembered by any of you who passed through our department 25 years ago, and he was at UCT before that and worked for the famous dung beetle research unit before that even. So Adrian's well-known, and certainly well-known in dung beetle service circles, world-renowned, and he's just recently produced this absolutely fantastic tome on the dung beetles of Southern Africa. Thank you very much. Sorry, I had to race through it. But if Charlene will permit, there's some time. Is Charlene still there?
Yes,
Charlene, you're not sleeping.
Of course not. No,
Okay.
this is was absolutely amazing. Thank you. Thanks, Clarke. I just want to congratulate you on your amazing books, and for all of us, from all of us, for documenting and summarizing the myriad of information out there, because there's so much literature out there that generally insect species richness are declining. So we're very thankful that you are highlighting the Southern African insect richness and just reminding us how lucky we are to live in this part of the world.
Indeed.
Okay, I would just like to open the floor. I see we have 107 participants, which is fantastic. And we have time for a few questions. So if anyone wants to put it in the chat box, or just raise your hand if you want to, or put your microphone on if you want to ask a question. I think everyone is overwhelmed by the diversity. We have one.
Leo Brock.
Leo. So Leo is asking, when will the books be published and where will they be sold? Very important question, Clarke.
Well, both. Can you hear me? Because I see my connection is unstable.
Yes, we can hear you.
If Leo is back in the country, he can get the book at any. The first one is the only one that's available. The second one will hopefully be out towards the end of the year, but the third one, the dung beetle one, will only be out within another year or so. So just have to be patient. But the first book is available. It has been for a long time, and it's. I would certainly recommend it, of course, but it covers many aspects of insect biology that I think that it should be of interest to a lot of people.
Thanks, Clarke. And I can just add there that it's available on the Strake Publishers website and all good bookstores. And at the Entomological Society meeting, they'll also be for sale in July, and I'll say more about that. Any other questions? We have a question firstly from Rob Kelly. Is there going to be anything on the electronic platforms? So I think perhaps, Rob, you mean e-books available?
The first book is available as an e-book. You would have to find out the details from Strake. We haven't talked yet about the next two. At the moment, we're just anxious to get them done. So.
Yeah. Okay, we have a next question from Peter Chavez. How many dung beetles can't fly?
How many species of dung beetles? Probably in Southern Africa. Some of them less. Some of the more obscure ones can't fly, some very small forest species, but there's a whole range of species up the west coast that are big, and they certainly can't fly. So I would estimate, just as probably maybe 10% or so, no, not that, 5% of our species can't fly.
The very famous Cercilian Bacchus, right?
Yes,
Is
that
that
one,
one
of
of them?
course,
Yeah,
well known
in
to
Adda,
people
yeah,
in the East.
in the Eastern Cape. From Marjorie Robenheimer, she asked, I'm wondering why we have insects evolved so small. So why yeah, good question.
Okay, well, this is a big physiological question. If I could just back off a little bit. Insects during the Carboniferous period, which was when a lot of our coal and oil and that sort of thing was deposited, because those are fossil plants, and because of the massive amount of respiring plant matter on Earth, there was more oxygen, about 60% more oxygen on Earth than we have now. And so the insects were correspondingly much bigger. And the reason for that is that insects basically are a function of their size. So if and oxygen, most of their oxygen is passively is kind of pushed into the insect by the environment, with a little bit of help, of course, from themselves. But if the oxygen, so they are basically limited by the amount of oxygen that they can utilize from the air that's pushed into their small bodies. So they've become smaller and smaller. And it's really a function of the percentage of oxygen, just in summary then, as a percentage of oxygen available to them to breathe. A very big insect wouldn't be able to get enough oxygen for metabolism to power its flight. So there's a range limitation on how big our insects can get, and that's as a result of the amount of oxygen that they can utilize.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more. Terence McCarthy, you've got your hand up. Would you like to ask a question? Be sure to unmute yourself.
Okay.
Great.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question. I've read about an idea that the radical morphological changes associated with this evolution, the change from a larva pupa moth, is a result of a symbiotic development of different species. What is the status of that notion nowadays?
Whoa, that's a potent question. Yeah, I'm actually not too sure what the background is to the question. That's something I think, you're welcome to give me a ring or email me. It's something that we could talk about. I'm not sure that, I think that probably the major hypothesis about why the insects, the holometabolic insects, the ones with the different with distinctly different life stages, egg, larva, pupa, adult, and that sort of thing, came about when conditions on Earth during the Permian period, when conditions on Earth started to dry out and warm up, and insects with a pupal stage were better able to survive unfavorable conditions than the ones that didn't have a pupal stage. But the question of the competition between larval stages and the adult stage, of course, that's a whole different story.
So, in other words, it's not resolved. The issue of the change in the shape of the insect. It's not resolved.
Well, I don't think these things ever get resolved. It really depends on who you talk to. But no, I think that there's still a lot to be discussed about this sort of thing. The other thing is the evolution of wings in insects. It's another just as controversial matter. When did it arise, and well, we know when it arose, but why and how. So this is another one of the big mysteries, evolutionary mysteries of insects.
Thank you. Thanks for the talk. Very interesting.
Pleasure.
Thanks for your question, Terence. I'll just allow one more from Guy Preston, who is asking if you cover invasive insects in the books, especially now with the problem with the polyphagous shottle borer beetle, and generally on biosecurity risks.
We mention the biology of the polyphagous shottle borer and a little bit about its introduction and where it came from and what it does and all this kind of stuff. But no, I mean, we don't have time to go into things like biosecurity, and there's just enough to talk about the biology. 850 pages, and I had to be beaten down with the knobkerrie because I was only getting into my stride. There was a lot more to say. So no, I'm afraid there's nothing about biosecurity. We actually try to emphasize the biology and the interest and the importance of insects to our well-being and to ecosystem functioning and that sort of thing, rather than emphasize the pests, because there's enough spoken about pests and that sort of thing, and there are enough books on pests, and there are enough people who work on pests. I'm in the other camp. I'm more interested in their general biology.
Yes. Thank you. And I also noted that if anyone's interested in the book, Pippa Parker from Strakers put the link in the chat box. And I've got one more. Sorry, everyone, if you need to go, you can go. Leo Brock wanted to make a quick comment. Leo, are you online?
Yes, if I may, and I apologize for holding everyone back. It's just to say that, in every generation and in every profession, there are certain individuals that stand out, giants in their profession. And in my humble experience over a lifetime of working in entomology, Clarke Scholtz is one of those giants in his profession. I had since my earliest days, honors years, the privilege of working with Clarke, the opportunity to approach him for his expert opinions, help with identifications. He was not just an expert on dung beetles and trogons, but as you see from these books now, very much a generalist with a very deep, specialized knowledge on all aspects of entomology. So Clarke, I think from our entire generation of entomologists that knew you, from all of us, a sincere token of appreciation for what you've meant to our profession. Know that you are highly respected. Everyone thinks very highly of you, and we wish you well.
Gracious. Thank you, Leo.
Thank you, Leo.
I'm flattered and overwhelmed. Thank you very much. Are you back in the country?
No, I'm based in Thailand now. Have been for the past 5 years, and will probably continue for a few more years. I get back to South Africa once a year. Wonderful country. Enjoy South Africa. It's a great country. Yeah.
Of course. Thank you, Leo.
Thanks, Leo, for those very fitting words. I think I wish we had more time, but I think I'm going to leave it at that. And I want to thank everyone for your attendance. Please keep an eye on the Entomological Society of Southern Africa's website at ensocsa.org.co.za. Sorry. We have a Facebook page, an Instagram and Twitter account, all ENSOC.SA. And Prof. Scholtz, thank you again for being our guinea pig for the webinar, being an excellent guinea pig. And yes, please keep your eye on the side and attend our Congress, which is in July. And we'll post all our details on our socials.